It's easy to believe that the comfort surrounding you today is simply a product of modern technology. But hidden somewhere in your home is a quiet device that keeps the temperature just right, and it represents the final chapter of a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. Long before electricity, insulation, or central heating existed, our ancestors faced winters so merciless that a single freezing night could end a life before dawn. Armed with little more than stone, bone, animal hides, fire, and remarkable determination, they accomplished something extraordinary. The most surprising part is that they didn't merely endure those brutal conditions, they mastered them. In fact, many of the survival techniques developed during the Ice Age resemble solutions engineers still rely on in extreme Arctic environments today. By the time this story is over, you may never look at the warmth of your own house in quite the same way again. Every comfortable room you enjoy is part of an inheritance passed through countless generations of people who refused to surrender to the cold. It's worth remembering that history often underestimates ancient people. Popular culture portrays them as primitive cave dwellers barely scraping through each day, but the archaeological evidence tells another story. They were designers, builders, and problem solvers who transformed bone, hide, frozen soil, and observation into life-saving technology. Sometimes the greatest inventions aren't created overnight. They evolve through thousands of years of careful experience. If this changes how you think about human history already, comment 1. If you believe our ancestors deserve far more credit than they usually receive. The first challenge wasn't building shelters, it was surviving the cold itself. 25,000 years ago, vast stretches of the Eurasian steppe regularly plunged to -40 degrees, the rare temperature where Celsius and Fahrenheit finally match. Under those conditions, exposed skin could freeze within minutes. Breathing felt like inhaling shards of glass, and every gust of wind stole body heat faster than the human body could replace it. Imagine standing on an endless plain with no forests nearby, no firewood to gather, and no buildings anywhere on the horizon. Only snow, frozen grass, and a wind that never seemed to stop. Even someone wearing modern winter clothing would struggle to survive a single night because hypothermia doesn't arrive dramatically. It quietly drains warmth away until the body simply can't keep up. Yet families lived entire lifetimes in this environment. Children were born there. Elders grew old there. Communities celebrated, mourned, created art, and built cultures in a landscape that seemed determined to erase human life. That alone forces us to ask a remarkable question. What did they know that we've forgotten? The answer begins with an archaeological discovery in Russia. Researchers uncovered large circular pits, dug carefully into frozen ground with surprising precision. These weren't random holes or abandoned excavations. Every one followed nearly identical dimensions, suggesting a deliberate engineering choice. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from patiently observing nature instead of trying to overpower it. Ancient people may not have written scientific formulas, but they paid attention to patterns for generations. Knowledge doesn't require textbooks when entire communities dedicate themselves to learning from the world around them. The depth of those pits was the real secret. While surface temperatures changed wildly between seasons, the soil several feet underground stayed relatively stable throughout the year. By digging 6 to 8 feet below the surface, Ice Age families found themselves living in an environment naturally 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the deadly air above, without burning a single extra piece of fuel. Think about what that discovery required. There were no thermometers, no mathematics, and no written records. Everything depended on observation, memory, and teaching. Someone noticed the pattern. Someone else tested it. Generation after generation refined the idea until digging to exactly the right depth became common knowledge. Every lesson survived because parents taught children, elders taught grandchildren, and communities protected knowledge as carefully as food. Human civilization wasn't built only by great inventors. It was built by ordinary people who refused to let hard-earned wisdom disappear. Instead of fighting winter directly, they found a way to let the earth itself become part of their shelter. And that ingenious decision was only the beginning of a much larger survival system. Around 26,000 years ago, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered Ice Age homes with walls built in multiple layers, each serving a different purpose. Animal hides lined the inside with the fur facing inward, trapping warm air around the people inside. A middle layer of dried grass and moss created insulation while pulling moisture away from the living space. Finally, woven bark and reeds formed an outer shell that blocked the wind while allowing water vapor to escape. The remarkable part isn't simply that these layers existed. It's that they performed the exact same functions found in modern insulated homes. Today's construction uses weather barriers, insulation, and vapor control. Their materials were different, but the underlying physics was identical. Great ideas often outlive the civilizations that first discover them. Materials evolve, technology changes, but the laws of nature remain constant. Sometimes innovation isn't about inventing something completely new. It's about rediscovering truths people learned thousands of years ago. Comment 2. If it surprises you that an Ice Age shelter followed many of the same engineering principles used in modern homes today, further east, archaeologists uncovered something even more astonishing. Entire houses had been built from the skeletons of woolly mammoths. Massive skulls served as foundations, towering tusks curved overhead to create structural arches, and enormous jaw bones were carefully interlocked around the perimeter to strengthen the walls. These weren't decorative displays. They were fully engineered homes designed to survive one of the harshest climates on Earth. Thick mammoth hides stretched over the bone framework created a sealed structure capable of resisting powerful winds and heavy snowfall. The scale alone is breathtaking. Some of these homes required the remains of nearly 100 mammoths, demonstrating an incredible level of planning, cooperation, and construction skill that few people associate with the Ice Age. Then scientists decided to answer the obvious question. Could these unusual structures actually keep people warm? Instead of guessing, researchers built full-sized reconstructions and measured their performance with modern instruments. The results stunned everyone involved. Even modest interior fires allowed these shelters to remain 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the freezing air outside. That performance rivals, and in some situations even exceeds, the thermal efficiency of certain modern Arctic shelters built with advanced synthetic materials. Suddenly, the label primitive begins to lose all meaning. Our ancestors weren't waiting for intelligence to evolve. They already possessed remarkable minds. What they lacked wasn't brain power, it was accumulated knowledge. Every engineering principle had to be discovered through observation, experimentation, failure, and persistence. They started with nothing and slowly built an understanding of heat, structure, and survival that still earns the respect of engineers today. But incredible insulation solved only part of the problem. Every tightly sealed shelter carried a hidden danger that was far more deceptive than the freezing air outside. Ironically, the very warmth keeping a family alive could also become the reason they died if the shelter wasn't designed correctly. The enemy was moisture. Every breath released invisible water vapor. Every cooking fire added more humidity. Melting snow for drinking water filled the air with even more moisture. Inside a sealed home surrounded by sub-zero temperatures, that vapor had nowhere to escape. It settled onto the cold walls and ceiling, where it froze into layers of ice night after night. Over time, the growing ice became dangerously heavy. It soaked valuable hides, weakened structural joints, and slowly pushed apart the bones supporting the shelter. Even worse, stale, damp air trapped alongside an indoor fire could quietly rob people of oxygen while they slept. The most dangerous threats aren't always the ones we can see. Throughout history, survival has often depended on recognizing invisible problems before they become deadly. Wisdom is sometimes nothing more than learning to notice what everyone else overlooks. Ancient builders understood this challenge surprisingly well. At settlements like Kostenki, archaeologists found carefully positioned openings near the bottom of shelters, along with larger vents near the roof. At first glance, they looked insignificant. In reality, they formed a brilliant natural ventilation system. Cold, dry air entered through the lower openings. As the fire warmed the interior, moist air naturally rose and escaped through the upper vents. Without fans, machinery, or moving parts, fresh air continuously replaced stale air while excess moisture left the shelter. Thousands of years before anyone wrote building codes, these people had already mastered passive airflow, using nothing but careful observation of nature. Modern architects still rely on exactly the same physical principles when designing energy-efficient buildings today. Comment 0. If you never imagined Ice Age families understood ventilation this well, fire itself was far more than a source of warmth. It served as the heart of the entire household. Archaeological excavations reveal that hearth placement followed deliberate planning rather than random convenience. A larger central fire heated the entire shelter, while several smaller hearths surrounded different activity areas. One section became the cooking space. Another provided steady light and warmth for repairing tools or crafting equipment. The warmest corners closest to the fire consistently contain evidence that infants and elderly family members spent the most time there. That detail says more about these communities than almost anything else. They weren't simply surviving day by day. They were organizing their homes around the needs of the most vulnerable people. Compassion was built directly into the floor plan. A civilization should never be measured only by its tools. It should also be judged by how it protects those least able to protect themselves. Even during humanity's harshest winters, kindness remained one of our strongest survival strategies. Another mystery remained. The Ice Age steppe contained very few trees, making firewood incredibly scarce. So how did these communities keep their fires burning through months of relentless winter? Chemical analysis of ancient hearths revealed an astonishing answer. They carefully collected and dried mammoth dung, which burned slowly for long-lasting heat. Fresh bones, rich in fat, served as a powerful, high-temperature fuel once properly prepared. Small amounts of precious wood acted only as kindling to ignite the bones until they burned on their own. Rather than burning whatever they happened to find, they developed a sophisticated fuel strategy. Different materials served different purposes. Slow fuel, hot fuel, and starter fuel were stored, managed, and rationed according to need throughout the winter season. That's remarkably similar to how modern societies manage energy resources today. Planning isn't only about solving today's problems. It's about preparing for challenges that haven't arrived yet. The construction of these mammoth bone homes reveals the same level of foresight. Building one required weeks of exhausting labor from entire groups of adults. Massive skulls had to be transported, tusks lifted into place, and enormous hides stitched together. None of this could possibly happen once winter arrived. That means construction began months earlier, while warm weather still covered the landscape. Archaeological evidence supports exactly that conclusion. These people weren't reacting to approaching danger. They were anticipating it long before the first snowfall appeared. Their planning extended underground as well. Storage chambers carved into permanently frozen soil acted as natural freezers, preserving enormous supplies of meat harvested during autumn hunts. Even during violent snowstorms, families could reach stored food without depending on fresh hunting, long before cities, agriculture, or refrigeration. These communities had already developed food preservation, seasonal logistics, and long-term resource management. They understood that survival wasn't won during winter. It was earned throughout the months before winter ever arrived. Eventually, another challenge demanded an equally remarkable solution. A shelter could protect an entire family, but hunters still had to leave its safety and step into the frozen wilderness alone. That necessity inspired one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements: clothing. Not loose animal skins thrown over the shoulders as movies often portray, but carefully tailored garments sewn together with finely crafted bone needles. The appearance of eyed needles in the archaeological record tells us something important. A needle only becomes useful when clothing is designed to fit closely around the body. These garments followed a layered system remarkably familiar today. Soft fur faced inward to trap warm air close to the skin. Tougher hides formed the outer shell, blocking wind, snow, and moisture. Different animals applied different materials depending on their unique properties, creating clothing optimized for warmth, durability, and weather resistance. If you read the label inside a modern expedition jacket, you'll find the same concept described with modern terminology: a base layer, an insulating layer, and a protective outer shell. Tens of thousands of years separate the materials, but the engineering philosophy remains virtually unchanged. Every piece of that clothing required constant attention. Archaeological evidence shows repeated repairs, fresh insulation, patched hides, and replaced structural materials year after year. These weren't disposable items. They were living systems that demanded continuous care. Every family became its own maintenance crew, inspecting, fixing, and improving everything before small problems turned into deadly ones. That mindset carries an important lesson. Survival rarely depends on one brilliant invention. More often, it depends on the discipline to maintain what already works. Consistency can be just as powerful as innovation. With shelter, fuel, clothing, and food all working together, Ice Age communities had solved one of the greatest physical challenges on Earth. But another question remains. How did they survive mentally? Imagine spending 14 or even 16 hours every day inside a shelter while darkness and lethal temperatures ruled the world outside. Human beings need more than food and warmth. They need purpose, connection, and hope. Surprisingly, part of the answer lies inside your own body. For most of human history, people didn't sleep in one uninterrupted block like many of us do today. Historical accounts from cultures around the world describe a different rhythm. People slept for several hours after sunset, naturally woke for an hour or two during the middle of the night, and then returned to sleep until dawn. This wasn't considered insomnia. It was normal. In 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Ware recreated long natural nights by removing artificial light from volunteers' lives. After only a few weeks, every participant gradually returned to that same two-stage sleeping pattern, suggesting that the rhythm still exists deep within us today. Sometimes our bodies remember things our culture has forgotten. Thousands of years of modern convenience may change our habits, but evolution leaves surprisingly deep fingerprints that continue shaping our lives. So what happened during those quiet hours between the first and second sleep? The answer: the fire. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years documenting conversations among the Yuhuansi people of the Kalahari, whose daily routines preserve echoes of humanity's ancient way of life. Her findings revealed an extraordinary pattern. During daylight hours, nearly every conversation focused on practical matters: food, hunting, work, planning, disagreements, and daily responsibilities. But once darkness fell and everyone gathered around the fire, the conversations transformed. Stories replaced schedules. Legends replaced logistics. People spoke about ancestors, mysterious forces, distant journeys, dreams, heroes, and the meaning behind life itself. Around 80% of nighttime conversations centered on imagination, memory, and shared identity rather than survival tasks. The campfire became humanity's first theater, first classroom, first place of worship, and first storytelling stage all at once. That realization changes everything. Inside those mammoth bone shelters, while winter storms raged beyond the walls, families weren't simply waiting for sunrise. They were passing knowledge between generations. They were creating myths, teaching values, explaining the world, and strengthening the bonds that held their communities together. Comment 1. If you believe stories are just as important to human survival as food and shelter, archaeological discoveries support this idea. Many of the famous Venus figurines discovered throughout Ice Age Europe appear inside winter living spaces, often close to household hearths. Likewise, much of the remarkable cave art associated with this era seems connected to the long months when people spent extended periods sheltered from the brutal weather outside. That means one of humanity's greatest artistic explosions didn't happen despite the harsh climate. It happened because of it. While freezing winds surrounded their homes, people carved statues, painted magnificent animals across cave walls, and left behind images that still inspire awe tens of thousands of years later. The cold did far more than test human endurance. It helped shape human imagination. Beauty, belief, and storytelling weren't luxuries reserved for peaceful times. They became essential tools that allowed communities to endure endless nights without losing hope. Eventually, however, this extraordinary body of knowledge began to disappear, not through invasion, not through catastrophe, not because it failed. It simply became unnecessary. As the climate gradually warmed, forests spread across once frozen landscapes. Wood became easier to find. Winters became less severe. New ways of living replaced the old ones. Generation after generation, techniques that had once meant the difference between life and death slowly faded from memory. Perhaps the greatest danger facing knowledge isn't destruction, it's comfort. When a skill is no longer essential, it can quietly vanish within only a few generations. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncovered those forgotten shelters, and modern engineers came to a remarkable conclusion. These Ice Age structures weren't crude attempts at engineering. They were engineering. Their geothermal shelter designs, layered insulation systems, passive ventilation, fuel management, and structural techniques all solved complex physical problems with astonishing effectiveness. Today, military survival programs and emergency response teams have adapted many of the same principles while developing shelters for extreme cold weather environments. History had come full circle. Humanity spent centuries rediscovering solutions our ancestors had already mastered using nothing more than earth, bone, hide, careful observation, and relentless determination. The next time your heater quietly switches on without demanding any effort from you, remember what that comfort once required. Every warm night enjoyed today rests upon countless generations who planned through the summer, stored food for winter, repaired every wall, managed every fire, and passed every lesson from parent to child without ever writing a single word. Comfort wasn't invented, it was inherited. It was earned by people who refused to surrender to impossible odds and whose ingenuity still echoes through every warm home on earth. And if their triumph over the cold amazes you, then one mystery remains. The freezing winters were never the greatest fear haunting these people. They had already conquered the ice. What truly terrified them waited beyond the reach of the firelight, hiding somewhere in the darkness, and understanding that fear may reveal something profound about ourselves even today.